Story 1. I'm a journalist, so I'm used to long hours on the road. The late nights, remote highways, and stretches of isolation have become second nature. That night was no different. At least, that's what I told myself. I was driving back from an interview in a small mountain town. The highway was dead quiet, just the soft hum of my tires on the asphalt and the occasional crackle of static from the radio. I had hours to go before I'd reach my hotel, but I was in the zone, the kind of focus you settle into when the world feels asleep. It started innocently enough. A pair of headlights appeared in my rearview mirror. No big deal, right? Probably another traveler heading home late. But as the minutes passed, I noticed something odd. The truck behind me wasn't passing or pulling back. It stayed locked to my bumper, its headlights glaring like two unblinking eyes. I slowed down, hoping he'd pass, but he didn't. The truck matched my speed perfectly. My pulse quickened. Maybe he didn't realize how close he was. I tapped the brakes lightly, a polite signal to back off. Instead, he inched closer, my mirrors filled with light, blinding me to anything beyond his hulking form. I decided to speed up, putting more distance between us. For a moment, it worked. The truck's headlights faded into the distance, and I exhaled a shaky breath. But then, the engine roared. The truck surged forward, closing the gap in seconds, this time tailgating me so closely I could feel the vibration of its engine through my car. This wasn't random. He was toying with me. I tightened my grip on the wheel, my mind racing for options. There were no exits, no rest stops, no gas stations, just miles of empty highways stretching endlessly in the dark. Isolated, I might not even have a lifeline. Excluded, and still the storm swirled around my head. My heart beat. I spotted a curve in the road ahead and decided to make my move. Slowing just enough to catch him off guard, I veered sharply onto a side road, my tires screeching as I took the turn. For a moment, I thought I'd lost him. The road was pitch black, and my headlights were the only ones cutting through the darkness. Then I saw them again. Headlights. The truck appeared in my rearview mirror, closer this time, barreling down the narrow road like a predator locked onto its prey. My chest tightened. He was relentless. My car wasn't built for speed, but I pressed the pedal to the floor, the engine whining as I pushed it harder than I ever had before. The truck followed, closing the distance, its high beams flooding my car with light. Panic clawed at me. I scanned the road ahead, desperate for anything. A house, a gas station, another car, anything that could break this nightmare. But there was nothing but endless black. Suddenly, the road forked, and without thinking, I veered left, tires skidding on the loose gravel. My heart pounded as I glanced in the mirror. The truck hesitated at the fork, its massive frame looming in the darkness. For a moment, it seemed to stop. Then, with a roar, it chose the other path. I didn't wait to see if it would change its mind. I sped down the road, not daring to slow until I saw the faint glow of lights in the distance. It was a diner, its neon sign flickering weakly in the dark. I pulled into the lot, skidding to a halt near the entrance. Inside, the warm glow of the diner felt like salvation. I stumbled out of the car, my legs shaking as I hurried inside. The waitress behind the counter looked up, startled by my entrance. "Oh, the police," I managed to say, my voice trembling. Someone was following me. She grabbed the phone without hesitation, glancing nervously at the door. I turned to look out the window, half expecting to see those headlights pulling into the lot. But the road was empty, silent except for the hum of the diner's fluorescent lights. When the police arrived, they took my statement, their faces grim as I described the truck and the relentless pursuit. "You're not the first to report something like this," one officer said. "We've had a few incidents on these highways lately, drivers being harassed, even run off the road." I shuddered, the weight of his words sinking in. The officer assured me they'd patrol the area and try to track down the driver, but the damage was already done. I didn't feel safe anymore. Even now, months later, I can't shake the memory of those blinding headlights and the truck that seemed determined to chase me into the dark. Every time I see headlights in my rearview mirror, I feel that same icy dread. On the open road, you're never really alone, and sometimes that's the scariest part. Story 2. Traveling alone comes with the territory when you're a lawyer. Late-night drives between cities for consultations and court appearances had become routine for me. I'd gotten used to the quiet isolation of country roads and the faint hum of the radio as my only companion. Still, there's something about driving at night that keeps you on edge, even when nothing seems out of place. That night, I had been on the road for a few hours, winding through a stretch of empty highway surrounded by nothing but darkness. The stars overhead were faint, swallowed by the heavy clouds that blanketed the sky. I hadn't passed another car in miles, and when I saw the faint glow of a gas station up ahead, I decided to stop. It was a small, old-fashioned station, the kind with one flickering light and a single pump. I pulled in and parked under the dim canopy, stepping out to stretch and refuel. The night air was still, the silence broken only by the rhythmic click of the pump as I filled my tank. "Need a hand with that?" The voice startled me. I turned sharply to see a man standing a few feet away, his baseball cap pulled low over his face. He looked to be in his 40s, his clothes worn and his posture casual. I hadn't heard him approach, which unsettled me immediately. Still, I forced a polite smile. "Oh no, I'm fine, thanks," I replied, focusing on the pump and hoping he'd move on. But he didn't. He lingered, standing just a little too close for comfort. His eyes flicked to my car, then back to me as if sizing me up. "Where you headed?" he asked, his tone friendly enough to mask the intrusive nature of the question. I kept my response light, trying not to sound offensive. "Just passing through. Long drive home." He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving me. "Long drive, huh? You know, it's not safe to be out here alone this late. Lots of folks out here who don't have the best intentions." His words sent a flicker of unease down my spine, but I shrugged it off. "I appreciate the concern," I said, focusing on the numbers ticking up on the gas meter. But he didn't stop. Flat tires, engine trouble, anything could happen out here. It's hard to get help when you're this far out. The way he said it felt deliberate, like he was planting the thought in my head. I forced another smile, though it felt brittle. "Yeah, that's true. But I'm good. Thanks." "Yeah." The man stepped a little closer, his shadow stretching toward me under the fluorescent light. "You traveling alone?" My guard shot up. His tone was too casual, the question too direct. My instincts screamed at me to lie. "No," I said smoothly. "My husband's right behind me. Should be here in a few minutes." The man's lips curled into a thin smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. That's smart. Always better to have someone with you out here. I nodded, avoiding his gaze, and prayed the pump would finish soon. The station felt unbearably quiet, the kind of silence that amplifies every little sound. The man took another step closer, his presence almost invasive now. "You know, I could follow you," he offered, his voice lowering. "Make sure you get where you're going safely." The tension in his tone was impossible to ignore. I gripped the pump handle tighter, willing it to click so I could get out of there. "That's really not necessary," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Like I said, my husband's on his way." The pump finally clicked, and I replaced the nozzle, heart pounding as I made my way to the driver's side. The man watched me the entire time, his gaze heavy and unrelenting. "Really?" he said, his tone now laced with something darker. "It's no trouble at all. I'd hate to see something happen to you out here." I met his eyes for the first time, holding his gaze despite the fear twisting in my chest. "Thanks, but I'll be fine," I said firmly, sliding into my car and locking the doors. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was still standing by the pump, watching me intently. Relief washed over me as I drove down the dark road, putting distance between us. But then, headlights appeared in my mirror. At first, I tried to tell myself it wasn't him. It couldn't be. But the truck stayed behind me, matching my speed exactly. I changed lanes and so did he. My pulse quickened as I realized he was following me. The truck edged closer, its headlights glaring into my mirrors. My breath came in shallow gasps as I scanned the road for an escape. There were no exits, no signs of civilization, just the unending stretch of highway. I couldn't call for help. My phone battery was nearly dead and I couldn't risk it dying completely. My only option was to lose him. I spotted an upcoming exit, a narrow road that led into a small town. Without hesitation, I took the turn sharply, my tires squealing against the pavement. For a brief moment, I thought I'd shaken him. But as I glanced in the mirror, the truck appeared again, its engine roaring as it closed the gap. My heart pounded as I drove through the quiet town, searching desperately for a safe place. Then, I saw it. A coffee shop, its neon sign casting a faint glow in the darkness. I pulled into the lot and parked near the entrance, hoping the light and presence of others would deter him. The truck followed, pulling into a space a few spots away. I didn't wait. I bolted out of my car and into the shop, the bell above the door jingling loudly. The barista looked up, startled, as I rushed to the counter. "Call the police," I said, my voice trembling. "Someone's following me." He nodded quickly, reaching for the phone. I glanced outside, my stomach twisting as I saw the man step out of his truck, his eyes fixed on the shop. Within minutes, flashing blue lights filled the lot. The man froze as officers approached him, questioning him as I watched from inside. After what felt like an eternity, one of the officers came to speak with me. "Says he was just trying to make sure you were safe," the officer said, his tone skeptical, "but will ensure he doesn't bother you again." I nodded, my hands still shaking. The officers escorted the man back to his truck, and I waited in the coffee shop until I was certain he was gone. I nodded in the coffee shop until I was certain he was gone. Even now, I can't shake the memory of his thin smile and unblinking stare. That night taught me a hard lesson. Danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes, it hides behind a polite offer, waiting for you to let your guard down. Story 3. I've been a paramedic for years, and helping people is second nature to me. I've run into burning buildings, knelt in the middle of busy highways, and navigated chaos more times than I can count. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. I was driving home from visiting my parents, my car cutting through a quiet stretch of road that felt completely removed from the world. It was one of those back roads you only take when you want to avoid the interstate, winding through forests and empty fields. The night was still, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, almost oppressive. I hadn't passed another car in over an hour, and the soft glow of my headlights was the only thing breaking the darkness. Then I saw it. Up ahead, just off the shoulder, a car sat with its hood popped open. At first glance, it seemed like a typical breakdown, but as I got closer, my headlights illuminated a figure lying face down on the pavement. They were completely still, arms stretched out in an unnatural way. My instincts kicked in immediately. Someone was hurt. Maybe they'd been hit or collapsed trying to fix their car. My foot hovered over the brake as I slowed, my eyes scanning the scene for more details. But something felt off. There were no skid marks on the road, no signs of a sudden stop or an impact. The car itself was too perfectly positioned, angled just enough to seem natural, but somehow staged. And then there was the figure. A man, by the look of him, lying so still it didn't seem right. My gut churned with unease, that little voice in the back of my head screaming that something wasn't adding up. Still, I couldn't just drive past. What if someone was genuinely in need? Against my better judgment, I pulled over, keeping my headlights trained on the scene and leaving my door open. "Hey," I called out, stepping cautiously toward the car. "Are you okay?" "No, boss." I approached slowly, the crunch of gravel under my feet loud in the stillness. The figure didn't move, didn't even flinch at the sound of my voice. My heart was pounding now, every step forward filling me with a growing sense of dread. Then I saw it, a shadow shifting just beyond the reach of my headlights. I froze. The movement had been subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I turned my head slightly, scanning the roadside brush for any sign of what I'd seen. The darkness pressed in, my vision straining against the void. "Hello?" I called out again, this time louder, my voice carrying into the night. Footsteps. They came from my right, faint but deliberate, the unmistakable sound of someone moving through the brush. My breath caught in my throat as I turned, my body tensing with adrenaline. Then I heard more footsteps, this time from my left. My blood turned to ice. Whoever they were, they weren't alone. I started backing up slowly, my eyes darting between the shadows on either side of me. The figure on the ground hadn't moved an inch, but now it felt more like bait than someone in need of help. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to calculate my next move. Before I could reach the safety of my car, 3 men stepped out of the shadows surrounding me. They were dressed in dark clothes, their faces obscured by the dim light. Each of them carried something, pipes or crowbars, it was hard to tell, but the glint of metal was unmistakable. The tallest of the 3 smirked as he stepped closer. "Wallet, keys, anything you've got," he said, his voice calm but edged with menace. I tried to keep my composure, but my mind was racing. These weren't amateurs. This was planned, deliberate. They had used the car and the figure as a trap, counting on someone like me, a good Samaritan, to take the bait. I reached into my pocket, pulling out my wallet and tossing it toward them. My keys followed, landing in the gravel with a dull clink. The tallest man gestured for the others to grab them, his smirk never faltering. "You've got a nice ride," he said, his tone almost conversational. "Shame you'll have to walk home." I didn't respond. My focus was on staying calm and getting out of this alive. One of the men climbed into my car, revving the engine as the others laughed. My stomach churned as I watched them prepare to take everything I had. But then the driver paused, glancing at my phone sitting in the cup holder. He picked it up, examining it for a moment, before stepping back out of the car. "You'll need this," he said, tossing it onto the pavement with a twisted grin. "Wouldn't want you stranded out here with no way to call for help." The mockery in his voice stung, but I kept my expression neutral, unwilling to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. They sped off into the night, the roar of my car's engine fading into the distance. I stood there for a moment, the silence rushing back in like a wave. My hands trembled as I picked up my phone, the screen cracked but still functional. I called the police immediately, my voice shaking as I explained what had happened. To their credit, they arrived faster than I expected, their flashing lights a beacon in the darkness. As I recounted the events to the officer, he nodded grimly. "You're not the first," he said. "We've had reports of similar setups along this stretch of road. They're targeting people who stop to help." Hearing that made my stomach turn even more. This wasn't just bad luck. It was a calculated scheme, preying on the kindness of strangers. They found my car a few days later, abandoned and stripped of anything valuable. The men were long gone, leaving behind only the bitter taste of fear and anger. That night changed something in me. As a paramedic, I've always believed in helping people, in running toward trouble instead of away from it. But now, every time I see a car on the side of the road, I hesitate. That instinct to help is still there, but it's tempered by the memory of those footsteps, those shadows, and the realization that not everyone has good intentions. Sometimes, the greatest danger doesn't come from the chaos of an emergency. It comes from the quiet, calculated malice of those who see kindness as an opportunity. Story 4. Most nights, I end up working late. My office is about 45 minutes from home, and the drive back is usually quiet and uneventful. No matter how tired I am, though, I've always had a soft spot for animals. If I see a stray on the road, I pull over. I can't count how many late-night drives have ended with me coaxing a scruffy dog out of a ditch or bundling a scruffy dog into my car. That night was no different, at least at first. I was driving home after a long client dinner that had gone later than expected. The highway stretched ahead of me, dark and deserted, with nothing but the hum of my engine and the low croon of the radio to keep me company. It was about 15 miles from the nearest town when I saw it, a small shape just off the shoulder, barely visible in the dim glow of my headlights. I eased off the gas, squinting to make it out. As I got closer, the shape resolved into something unmistakable. A dog. It was tied to a post, its matted fur damp and clinging to its thin frame. My heart clenched. Who could abandon a dog like this? It just sat there, motionless, as if it had already given up. I didn't think twice. I pulled over, grabbed the leash I always keep in my trunk, and got out of the car. "Hey, little guy," I murmured as I approached. The dog didn't move, didn't bark, just watched me with wide, glistening eyes that shone under the beam of my headlights. It was a tiny thing, barely bigger than a rabbit, and it looked utterly defeated. I crouched down, keeping my voice soft and soothing. "It's okay, I'm here to help." But as I reached for the rope tied around its neck, something caught my attention in my peripheral vision. Movement. I turned my head, and my heart sank. Two figures were standing at the edge of the tree line, their silhouettes barely visible in the dim light. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching. At first I thought they might be the dog's owners, maybe checking to see why I'd stopped. "Is this your dog?" I called out, trying to keep my tone neutral. No response. I straightened, my pulse quickening. Something about their stillness was wrong, unnerving. The taller of the two figures shifted, stepping slightly closer. Now I could make out more details. Broad shoulders, hands hanging loose at his sides. His posture was casual, but there was something predatory about it, like he was waiting for something. The second figure, smaller and thinner, lingered in the shadows, his face obscured by the darkness. The dog whimpered softly, tugging weakly at the rope around its neck. My unease deepened. "Hey," I called out again, louder this time. "If this is your dog, I'm just trying to help. Maybe we can—" "Stop talking," the taller man interrupted, his voice low and cold. My stomach dropped. The glint of metal in his hand caught my eye. He was holding a gun. My mind raced as he raised it, his movements deliberate and terrifyingly calm. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, taking another step toward me. "We're going to your car. You're going to drive us to an ATM and take out as much cash as you can. No fuss, no calls, and you'll walk away just fine. Got it?" Before I could respond, the second man moved, closing the distance between us in 2 quick strides. He grabbed my arm, his grip like a vice. I opened my mouth to protest, to say anything, but the words stuck in my throat. The reality of the situation was suffocating. Then, out of nowhere, the low rumble of an engine broke the silence. Headlights flooded the scene as a massive semi pulled onto the shoulder, screeching to a halt just a few feet behind my car. The sound was deafening, and for a moment everyone froze. The driver's door slammed open, and out stepped a tall, burly man with a gun in his hand. His face was set in a mask of cold fury as he strode toward us. "Drop the gun and let her go," he bellowed, his voice echoing across the empty stretch of road. The two men froze, their heads snapping toward the trucker. I could feel the grip on my arm loosen slightly as the tension in the air became almost unbearable. The trucker took another step closer, his gun trained steadily on the larger man. "I'm not asking twice," he growled, his tone low and dangerous. For a moment, it looked like the men might try something. The taller one glanced at his partner, his jaw tightening as he weighed his options. But the trucker's unwavering stance seemed to make the decision for him. Slowly, they let me go, their hands raised as they backed away into the shadows. "Get in your car," the trucker said, his voice firm but calm. I didn't argue. My hands were shaking as I untied the dog, whispering an apology as I left it behind. I hated leaving it there, but I couldn't risk taking it with those men watching. Once inside my car, I locked the doors and started the engine. The trucker gave me a quick nod, his own gun still raised as he kept his eyes on the two men retreating into the darkness. "I'll follow you," he called out. "Make sure they're gone for good." I pulled back onto the highway, the truck's headlights steady behind me. My mind raced, replaying the events over and over. By the time I reached the next town, my hands were still trembling. I stopped at a well-read gas station and called the police, giving them all the details I could remember. They assured me they'd send someone out to check the area, but I knew the men would be long gone. The next day I heard back from animal control. They'd found the dog safe and unharmed, but there was no sign of the two men. Since that night, I've been more cautious. I still have a soft spot for animals, but now I know better than to stop without thinking. The world isn't as kind as I wish it was, and I'll always be grateful to that trucker who showed up just in time. Story 5. The highway stretched endlessly in front of me, a ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the horizon. The GPS had warned me this route would be desolate, but I didn't have a choice. Construction on the main interstate meant this back road was my only option. It was the kind of highway you imagine in ghost stories. No streetlights, no signs of life, just mile markers counting down the void. It was around midnight when the first pang of unease hit me. My car's high beams pierced the darkness, illuminating only the occasional reflector or distant curve. The radio was my only companion, though the static made it more unnerving than comforting. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour, and the solitude felt oppressive. Then I saw the car. It was pulled over on the shoulder, hazards blinking weakly in the distance. As I drew closer, I noticed the hood was up and a figure was leaning over the engine. My first instinct was to slow down. Maybe they needed help. But as my headlights swept over the scene, something stopped me. The figure wasn't moving. It was bent over the engine, perfectly still, like a statue frozen in the act of fixing something. I squinted, trying to make out details, but the shadows obscured the face, leaving only a vague silhouette. A chill ran down my spine, and I pressed the gas, telling myself I was imagining things. Maybe they were just taking a break, or maybe they'd called for help already. That's what I told myself as the car disappeared in my rearview mirror. But 10 minutes later, I saw another car on the side of the road. This one was different, an older model, its paint chipped and rusted. The hood was up again, and there was another figure leaning over it. Same posture, same eerie stillness. I slowed to a crawl, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't possible. I hadn't passed a turnoff, and no one had driven past me. It couldn't be the same car. Could it? I sped up, gripping the wheel tighter. The road seemed darker now, the shadows along the edges thicker and more oppressive. The hum of the tires on the asphalt felt deafening. Then, just a few miles later, there it was again. The same car. The same figure. This time, I didn't slow down. I kept driving, my eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. I half expected the car to start following me, but it didn't. It just sat there, its blinking hazards fading into the distance. I tried to shake off the fear, focusing on the road ahead. But the farther I drove, the more the darkness seemed to press in, swallowing the edges of the highway. The mile markers passed slower, almost as if the road was stretching out beneath me. Then, the radio cut out. The sudden silence was jarring. I reached for the knob, twisting it to find another station, but all I got was static. The air inside the car felt heavy, suffocating. And that's when I saw it again. The car. It was directly in front of me this time, parked diagonally across the road, blocking both lanes. The figure was standing now, illuminated by my high beams. Its face was obscured by the shadows, but I could feel its eyes on me. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop just a few feet away. My hands were trembling as I stared at the figure frozen in place. Then it started to move. Slow, deliberate steps, closing the distance between us. My instinct screamed at me to reverse, to turn around, to do something, but I couldn't move. The figure stopped just short of my hood, its head tilting as if studying me. Then it raised a hand and pointed down the road. I followed the gesture, squinting into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing. But then, in the faint glow of my headlights, I saw more figures, dozens of them lining the sides of the road like a silent audience. My chest tightened as the figure in front of me lowered its arm and took another step closer. That was enough to break my paralysis. I threw the car into reverse, tires screeching as I backed away. My headlights swung wildly, casting fleeting glimpses of the figures standing eerily still. I found a side road and took it without hesitation, my heart racing as I sped away. The narrow path twisted through the forest, the trees closing in on either side like rasping hands. For hours I drove, taking turn after turn, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and that highway. When I finally reached a gas station at the edge of a small town, the relief was overwhelming. The attendant gave me a strange look as I stumbled inside, shaking and pale. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, half joking. I didn't respond. How could I explain what had happened? Even now, I don't know what I saw that night. All I know is that I'll never take that highway again. Some roads aren't meant to be traveled. Story 6. It was supposed to be a straightforward drive, just a 4-hour trip to visit my sister in the next state over. I had done it countless times before, taking the same stretch of Route 23, a long, winding highway that cuts through miles of farmland and dense forest. It's one of those roads that feels timeless, unchanged for decades. The day had slipped away faster than I'd planned, and by the time I was on the highway, it was already close to midnight. The road was quiet, almost unnaturally so. No other cars in sight, no lights except for my own. The stars were hidden behind thick clouds, and the only sounds were the crackle of my engine and the occasional crackle of static from the radio. I'd been driving for about an hour when I saw the first sign of trouble. A lone car was pulled off to the side of the road, its hazard lights blinking weakly. The car looked old, with peeling paint and a sagging bumper. Next to it, a figure stood under the faint glow of the red lights, waving me down. I slowed instinctively, the beam of my headlights sweeping over the scene. The man looked middle-aged, his clothes worn and his face pale. He gestured frantically as I approached, stepping closer to the edge of the road. "Help!" he called out, his voice cracking. "Please, I need help." I rolled down my window slightly, enough to hear him, but not enough to let my guard down. Something about the situation felt off. "What's wrong?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "My wife," he said, pointing toward the car. She's hurt. I think she's having a heart attack or something." I glanced at the car, but the interior was pitch black. No movement, no sign of anyone else inside. My gut told me to keep driving, but the man's desperation felt real. What if someone truly needed help? "Do you have a phone?" I asked. "I can call for an ambulance." The man shook his head violently. "No signal out here," he said, his voice trembling. "Please, you have to come check. She's inside." I hesitated, gripping the wheel tightly. Something wasn't adding up. The road had been empty for miles. Where had this car come from? And why wasn't the woman responding if she was in such bad shape? "I'll stay here and call for help as soon as I get a signal," I said firmly. The man's expression changed instantly. The fear and desperation drained from his face, replaced by something colder, something calculating. "That's not going to work," he said, his voice low. Before I could react, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife. My stomach dropped as he took a step closer to my car, the blade catching the light from my dashboard. Flashlight darts was funny. It made it clear who the hero was. "Get out," he ordered, his tone deadly calm. Panic surged through me. Without thinking, I slammed on the gas, my tires kicking up gravel as I sped away. The man shouted something after me, but his voice was quickly drowned out by the roar of my engine. My heart was pounding as I drove, my hands gripping the wheels so tightly they ached. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him chasing me, but the road behind was empty. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Just a few miles down the road, I saw another car. This one was parked in the middle of the lane, its driver's door wide open. As I slowed to maneuver around it, I saw a figure standing near the front of the car, a woman this time. Her hair was disheveled, her face streaked with what looked like blood. She staggered toward me, her hands outstretched. "Help me," she cried, her voice hoarse. My foot hovered over the brake, but the memory of the man with the knife was fresh in my mind. I couldn't trust this. I swerved round the car, keeping my speed steady as she screamed after me. For the next 10 minutes, I couldn't shake the image of her face. Was she part of the same setup? Or had I just abandoned someone who genuinely needed help? The guilt gnawed at me, but I couldn't afford to take the risk. I kept driving, my eyes darting between the road ahead and the mirrors. The farther I went, the darker the road seemed to become. The mile markers, which had been ticking down steadily, now felt inconsistent. Some were missing entirely, while others seemed to repeat. I passed another car, and then another, each one abandoned in eerily similar ways. One had all 4 doors open, as if its occupants had fled in a hurry. Another had its headlights on, but no sign of a driver. My unease grew with each passing mile. It felt like the road was playing tricks on me, shifting and distorting the farther I went. Even the landscape began to change. The dense forests gave way to wide open fields, but instead of feeling expansive, the emptiness felt oppressive, like I was being watched. Then I saw the figure in the road. It was standing dead center directly in my path. I slammed on the brakes, my car screeching to a halt just a few feet away. It was the man from before. He was standing perfectly still, his knife dangling loosely from one hand. His face was twisted into a grin, but his eyes were cold, empty. You sound like... I'm so sorry for whatever I did." "You can't leave," he said, taking a step closer. "This road doesn't let you leave." I threw the car into reverse, my heart pounding as I tried to back away, but as my headlights swept the road behind me, I saw them. Dozens of figures emerging from the darkness. They lined the edges of the road, their faces obscured but their intent clear. I slammed the gear into drive, veering sharply to avoid the man in front of me. My tires skidded, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I'd lose control, but the car held, and I sped forward, weaving around the figures as they stepped closer. The road ahead seemed endless, stretching farther and farther no matter how fast I went. My gas gauge was dipping dangerously low, but I didn't dare stop. The figures continued to appear, sometimes on the shoulder, sometimes in the middle of the lane, their eyes following me as I passed. I lost track of time. Hours seemed to blur together as I drove, my only focus on the horizon. The mile markers were gone now, replaced by nothing but an unbroken line of asphalt. Finally, just as my gas light blinked on, I saw it, a faint glow in the distance, a sign of life. It was a small diner, its neon sign flickering weakly. I pulled into the lot, my car sputtering as I came to a stop. The place was empty, eerily quiet except for the hum of the neon lights. I stepped inside, my legs trembling. The waitress behind the counter looked up, her expression unreadable. "Long night?" she asked. I nodded, my throat too dry to respond. "You're not the first," she said, sliding a cup of coffee toward me. "This road has a way of keeping people." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I turned to look out the window and my stomach dropped. The figures were there, standing just beyond the edge of the parking lot, their outlines barely visible in the flickering light. Story 7. I've always been a night driver. There's something calming about an empty road, the hum of the engine, and the way the world seems to shrink down to just your headlights and the stretch of asphalt ahead. That night was no different. I had a long drive ahead, 300 miles to the next state for a conference. I'd planned to leave earlier in the day, but life got in the way and I didn't hit the road until well after dark. The first few hours were uneventful. I had my music playing softly, a half-empty coffee cup in the cup holder, and nothing but the open road to keep me company. Route 47 wasn't well traveled, even during the day, and at night it felt like a forgotten stretch of highway. No towns, no gas stations, just miles of blacktop cutting through dense forest. It must have been around 1 a.m. when I first noticed the car. It was just a pair of headlights in the distance at first, too far back to give much thought to, but as the minutes passed, the lights drew closer. I glanced at my speedometer. I wasn't speeding, but I wasn't crawling either. Whoever they were gaining fast. The car pulled up behind me, its headlights bright in my rearview mirror. Too bright. I winced, adjusting the mirror to block the glare. "Just pass me," I muttered, glancing at the empty road ahead. But they didn't. Instead, the car settled behind me, maintaining a disturbingly close distance. I slowed down slightly, hoping they'd take the hint and go around, but they didn't. They stayed right on my bumper, their lights glaring into my car like a second sun. A sliver of unease crept up my spine. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were just nervous about driving on a dark road. Maybe they were unfamiliar with the area. But as the minutes dragged on, it became clear this wasn't normal. When the next exit appeared, I decided to take it. The turnoff led to a small rest area, just a few vending machines and a parking lot, but at least it was lit. I figured if they followed me, I could confront them or at least call for help. I signaled and took the exit, my heart pounding as I watched the headlights in my mirror. For a moment, it looked like they were going to keep going straight, but at the last second, they swerved onto the exit, following me. My stomach churned as I pulled into the rest area, parking near one of the lights. The car rolled in behind me, coming to a stop a few spaces away. It was an older model sedan, its paint faded and its windows tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. The engine idled for a moment before shutting off. The silence that followed was deafening. I stayed in my car, gripping the wheel tightly. My phone was on the passenger seat, and I debated calling the police, but what would I even say? There's a car following me, and it's freaking me out. They'd probably tell me to keep driving unless something happened. As I stared at the car, the driver's door opened. A man stepped out, his silhouette illuminated by the rest area lights. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He didn't look in my direction. Instead, he walked slowly to the front of his car, leaning against the hood. And then he just stood there staring at me. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I was frozen, my mind racing. Why wasn't he saying anything? Was he waiting for me to get out of the car? After what felt like an eternity, I decided I couldn't just sit there. I started the engine, my headlights flooding the rest area. The man didn't flinch. He just stayed there, staring. I threw the car into reverse, backing out of the space as quickly as I could. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced in the mirror. He was still standing there, motionless. But then his headlights turned on. The car lurched forward, pulling out of the lot and back onto the highway. My chest tightened as I realized he was following me again. I pressed the gas, my speed climbing as I tried to put distance between us. The highway was deserted, the dark expanse stretching endlessly in both directions. The sedan stayed close, matching my speed, no matter how fast I went. After 20 agonizing minutes, I spotted an exit sign for a town I didn't recognize. Without hesitation, I took it, my tires squealing as I made the sharp turn. The road led into a small cluster of buildings, a diner, a gas station, and a motel. I pulled into the gas station, parking near the pumps and bolting inside. The clerk, a young guy with earbuds in, looked up as I burst through the door. "Call the police," I said, my voice trembling. "Someone's following me." The clerk blinked, pulling out one earbud. "What?" "There's a car." I turned, pointing toward the lot, but the sedan was gone. I stared at the empty street, my heart hammering in my chest. How could it have vanished so quickly? "Look, I'll call if you want," the clerk said, "but there's no one out there." I nodded, trying to steady my breathing. Maybe he'd given up. Maybe he realized I wasn't worth the trouble. I stayed in the gas station for nearly an hour, waiting until I felt safe enough to leave. When I finally got back on the road, I kept my eyes glued to the mirrors, scanning for any sign of the sedan. I didn't see it again. But even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting, every time I'm on a dark highway. Every time headlights appear in my mirror, I can't help but wonder, is it him? And what will happen if he catches me next time? Story 8. The road stretched ahead, empty and endless. I'd been driving for hours, the glow of my dashboard the only light breaking the oppressive darkness. It was the kind of night where the world felt small, like the darkness pressed in from all sides. My GPS had long since lost its signal, leaving me to rely on memory and the faint hope of roadsides. The gas gauge hovered just above empty. I'd been meaning to stop earlier, but the exits had grown farther apart as I got deeper into rural territory. Finally, like a mirage in the desert, a flickering neon sign appeared in the distance. "Gas and Go open 24 hours, it read. I sighed in relief, pulling into the lot. The station was ancient, one of those single pump setups with cracked pavement and a convenience store that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. The flickering light above the pump buzzed faintly, and the place was completely deserted. As I stepped out of my car, the chill in the air hit me, sharp and biting. I swiped my card at the pump and waited. But nothing happened. The screen stayed blank, unresponsive. I cursed under my breath and glanced toward the store. The lights were on inside, but there was no sign of movement. Reluctantly, I walked to the door. A small bell jingled as I stepped inside, the sound oddly muted. The air smelled stale, like old cleaning supplies and dust. Rows of snacks and faded advertisements filled the small space, but no one was behind the counter. "Hello?" I called out. My voice echoed faintly, swallowed by the stillness. No response. I leaned over the counter, trying to peer into the back room. "Anyone here? I need to get gas." Still nothing. Unease prickled at the back of my neck. The place felt wrong, like I'd stepped into a photo of a gas station instead of the real thing. Everything was too quiet, too still. Even the buzzing neon outside seemed muffled. I was about to turn back to my car when I heard a faint shuffling sound coming from the back room. "Hello?" I called again, my voice sharper now. The sound stopped abruptly. I hesitated, my pulse quickening. Part of me wanted to leave, to get back in my car and drive until the gas ran out, but the rational part of my brain insisted I couldn't leave without fuel. "Excuse me," I said, stepping closer to the counter. "I just need to—" A figure emerged from the back room. It was a man, or at least I thought it was at first. He was tall and thin, his clothes hanging off him like they didn't fit. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes didn't look right. They were too wide, too bright, like they were reflecting light that wasn't there. "Pump not working?" he asked, his voice raspy and flat. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, I need gas." He didn't move. Just stood there, staring at me with those unnatural eyes. Oh, the silence stretched uncomfortably long before he finally nodded. "Pay here," he said, pointing to the register. I pulled out my card, fumbling slightly as I handed it to him. His fingers brushed mine as he took it, and his skin was ice cold. While he processed the payment, I glanced around the store, trying to shake the growing unease. My eyes landed on a bulletin board near the entrance, cluttered with old flyers and missing person posters. A lot of missing person posters. "Long drive?" the man asked, breaking the silence. I looked back at him, startled. He was watching me again, his head tilted slightly, like he was studying me. "Yeah," I said cautiously, "just passing through." He nodded slowly, handing back my card. "Be careful, roads get dangerous around here at night." I didn't respond, just muttered a quick thanks and headed for the door. As I stepped outside, the air felt colder than before, the darkness heavier. I started pumping gas, my eyes darting back to the store every few seconds. The man was still standing at the counter, watching me through the glass. I stood there looking at him for several moments with a feeling that the pump clicked, signaling it was full. I replaced the nozzle and climbed back into my car, locking the doors out of habit. As I started the engine, I glanced at the store one last time. The man was gone. I didn't see him leave. He wasn't behind the counter, and the back room was out of sight. My chest tightened as I scanned the lot, but it was empty. Shaking it off, I pulled out of the station and back onto the highway. The darkness swallowed the road again, but this time it felt different, heavier, like it was alive. That's when I noticed the headlights. At first, they were far back, faint pinpricks in the rearview mirror, but they grew closer, faster than seemed possible. Within moments, they were right behind me, flooding the interior of my car with blinding light. I sped up, my heart pounding as I tried to put distance between us. The headlights matched my speed, staying on my bumper no matter how fast I went. Then they started flashing. Bright, strobing bursts of light filled my mirrors, disorienting me. I clenched the wheel, trying to keep control as the car behind swerved erratically, almost like it was trying to run me off the road. My mind raced. Was it the man from the station? Someone else? Why were they doing this? Suddenly, the car pulled into the opposite lane, its engine roaring as it sped up to pass me. For a moment, I thought it would just go by, but instead, it swerved sharply in front of me, forcing me to slam on the brakes. My car skidded to a stop, the tire screeching against the pavement. The other car stopped too, just ahead, its tail lights glowing like red eyes in the dark. The driver's door opened and the figure from the gas station stepped out. I didn't wait to see what he wanted. Throwing the car into reverse, I spun around and sped back the way I'd come, my heart racing as the glow of his tail lights disappeared behind me. I didn't stop until I reached a small town an hour later, pulling into a brightly lit diner. I stayed there until sunrise, surrounded by the comforting hum of other people. The next day, I tried to find the gas station on my GPS to report what happened, but it wasn't there. Route 47 is long, desolate, and strange, and if you ever find yourself low on gas in the middle of the night, I'd recommend waiting until morning, because not every station you find is meant for travelers like us.